We have 50 states to choose from.
We lay everything on the altar for the truth.
What Jonathan Lamb just revealed left everyone speechless. In a brand new interview, he breaks his silence about the billion-dollar inheritance tied to Daystar, and what he says flips the entire story upside down. It's not just about money. It's about legacy, secrecy, and a family power shift no one expected. If you thought you knew what was happening behind the scenes at Daystar, think again. This changes everything. When Jonathan Lamb was growing up, the idea that he would one day take over Daystar wasn't just a dream, it was an expectation. His father, Marcus Lamb, had built the network from scratch into one of the most powerful Christian media empires in the world. Jonathan wasn't just in the background, he was being prepared, step by step, to carry the torch. So when Marcus passed away in 2021, the transition plan wasn't just whispered about. It was written down, signed, sealed, and ready to go. Jonathan Lamb was named as the future president of Daystar. Not maybe, not hopefully, officially, and everyone inside the organization knew it. It wasn't just about filling a job. It was legacy, pure and simple. A billion-dollar media empire with millions of viewers across the globe was now positioned to stay in the family. Jonathan had the experience, the name, and the blessing. It was a clear path. One most people would never question. After all, how many people in the world are handed that kind of leadership role in writing? Not guessed, not assumed, promised. But the story didn't go the way everyone expected. From the outside, it may have looked like Jonathan was stepping right into his father's shoes. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. With the title of vice president came pressure, not just to lead, but to conform. Jonathan wasn't just being asked to keep Daystar afloat. He was being asked to keep the narrative alive. That meant protecting the image. That meant staying silent about certain things. That meant playing along, even when something didn't feel right. And that's where things started to break down. Because Jonathan and his wife Susie weren't just riding the wave of a media empire. They were having quiet, painful conversations at home. They were wrestling with God. They were asking hard questions. Jonathan wasn't just stepping into a role. He was stepping into a storm of conscience. He began to see that taking the job might mean compromising everything he believed in. He realized that the inheritance wasn't just a title or a paycheck. It was a test. A test of character, a test of obedience, a test of whether he would follow God or follow the script.
That was the time we were more ready than ever. I mean, it was the wrestle and breaking of me begging God, when will Jonathan be ready?
People might think it was easy to walk away from the role. After all, if he truly had faith, shouldn't the mission come first? But here's the thing. It wasn't the mission that Jonathan questioned. It was what the mission had become. A media empire built on faith had started to feel like just an empire, with money, power, politics, and somewhere along the way, the quiet voice of God had been replaced by the loud machinery of television production and PR management. Jonathan saw it clearly, and it broke him. He knew he had a choice. He could go along with it, smile for the cameras, keep the peace, and inherit it all. Or he could walk away from everything that was promised to him, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And that's exactly what he did. With a signed plan in place and a title within reach, Jonathan and Susie stepped back. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but with peace, because they knew that staying silent would have meant betraying their convictions. The inheritance was real. The opportunity was massive. But Jonathan realized that calling isn't about comfort, it's about obedience, and sometimes that means saying no to everything the world says you should want. He didn't lose Daystar, he gave it up, and in doing so he gained something even more valuable. A clean heart, a clear path, and the kind of peace you can't fake on camera. When people hear the name Lamb, especially in connection with Daystar, their minds often go straight to money. Big money. Private jets, luxury homes, designer clothes, million-dollar studios. It's not hard to see why. Daystar was a billion-dollar Christian media empire, broadcasting around the world. The cameras, the lights, the polished interviews. It all painted a picture of success, blessing, and abundance. So naturally, people assumed the family behind it must be swimming in wealth, a millionaire ministry dynasty. But when you peel back the layers, that picture starts to fade. And what you find underneath is a story that's not just different, it's surprising. For years, Jonathan and Susie Lamb lived under the weight of that myth. People looked at them and saw privilege. They assumed every part of their life was cushioned by massive income. And sure, there were moments where the money came in. When Marcus Lamb passed away and Jonathan officially stepped into a leadership role, the paycheck got bigger. In 2022, both Jonathan and Susie were receiving salaries that reflected their new roles. But here's what most people missed. That financial stability didn't last long. In fact, it lasted barely a year. And even when they were being paid well, it wasn't what people thought. It wasn't wealth built on luxury. It was stability. After years of financial pressure, missed opportunities, and sacrifices most never saw. For a long time, Susie wasn't earning anything near a six-figure salary. In fact, she was making less than someone working full-time at a local coffee shop. But she didn't complain. Her heart was in ministry, in family, in raising kids and serving others. They weren't flying first class every weekend or building second homes in the mountains. They were paying bills, managing debt, carrying a mortgage like millions of other American families. It was the reality behind the cameras. It wasn't glamorous. It was normal. And then came the decision that changed everything. Jonathan and Susie walked away. Not just from their jobs, but from the entire system. From the platform, the spotlight, and the myth that their life was perfect. They stepped down from guaranteed income. They turned away from the inheritance that had been promised in writing. They let go of their positions not because they were forced out, but because their faith demanded it. They didn't agree with the direction things were going. They didn't feel peace about what they were being asked to support, and they refused to keep pretending. People talk a lot about giving it all up for God. But when Jonathan and Susie did it, most people didn't understand. Why walk away from so much, they asked. Why not just stay and fix things from the inside? But what those people didn't see were the nights Jonathan spent on his knees, wrestling with God. They didn't see the conversations behind closed doors, the pressure, the politics, the quiet compromises that add up slowly, eating away at your soul. They didn't see Susie looking at their children and wondering what kind of legacy they were passing down if they stayed quiet just to keep the salary. The truth is, wealth in ministry often comes with strings. It's not just about money. It's about silence, about loyalty, about knowing when to smile and when to look the other way. For Jonathan and Susie, that was the line they couldn't cross. They didn't want to become symbols of success while compromising the very values they claimed to live by. And so, they left. Willingly, knowing it would cost them. And the cost was real. After leaving Daystar, their income disappeared almost overnight. They still had bills. Still had their house. Still had kids to feed. They weren't sitting on some secret fortune. There was no golden parachute. There was just faith. Raw, unpolished faith that somehow God would take care of them, even without the safety net. One of the most powerful parts of their story is how open they've been about all of this. In their interview, there was no pretending, no glossy cover story, just two people sitting side by side, admitting that they were scared, unsure, and completely reliant on God. They talked about downsizing, about possibly having to sell their house if things got tighter, about budgeting, cutting back, making ends meet. It's not the kind of story Christian media usually shares, but maybe it's the one people need to hear most. Because here's the truth. The myth of the millionaire ministry family has hurt a lot of people. It creates unrealistic expectations. It feeds jealousy. It stirs up doubt. It tells ordinary believers that blessing looks like Bentleys and bank accounts, when in reality, blessing often looks like obedience in the middle of loss. The Lambs didn't walk away rich. They walked away real. And that might be the most powerful legacy they leave behind. Their story is a reminder that being in ministry doesn't always mean being set for life. Sometimes it means setting aside everything, your paycheck, your status, your platform, to follow God when He calls you somewhere unexpected. Jonathan and Susie didn't just reject wealth. They rejected the illusion that success in ministry has to come with power, money, or control, and in doing so, they chose something far more valuable. Peace. Not the peace that comes from knowing your bills are paid, but the kind that comes from knowing you didn't sell your soul for a title. There is a quiet strength in that kind of decision, a rare kind of bravery. Because the myth of the millionaire ministry family is loud, seductive, and relentless. But Jonathan and Susie Lamb stood up to it. They said, No more. No more pretending. No more performing. No more buying into a system that rewards silence and punishes conviction. They could have stayed. They could have played the game. But they chose the harder path, and in doing so, they exposed the truth that so many have been afraid to say out loud. Real ministry isn't about money. It's about surrender. And sometimes, the most faithful thing you can do is walk away from everything the world says is a blessing, so you can finally live free. For a long time, Jonathan and Susie Lamb lived in a world most people only saw from the outside. Flashy lights, big broadcasts, a billion-dollar Christian media empire called Daystar. It looked perfect. To many viewers, Jonathan was the natural heir to a legacy built by his late father, Marcus Lamb. He had the name, the presence, and most importantly, the promise. It was in writing. He was supposed to take over as president. The empire was his to lead. But what most people didn't know is that behind the scenes, everything felt off. Jonathan didn't walk away because he was bored. Susie didn't leave because of a better opportunity. They had everything people think they want: security, influence, money. But something inside them started to shift. Slowly at first, then louder. It wasn't about status anymore. It was about conscience. Something wasn't aligning. The values they preached were starting to collide with the reality they were living, and for people who had built their lives around faith, that collision was impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that didn't feel like faith. Politics were creeping in. Power was being protected more than people. The more they saw, the harder it became to pretend everything was fine. And the truth is, they could have stayed. They could have kept their titles, held on to their salaries, and smiled for the cameras. That would have been easy. But they knew it wouldn't be honest. Jonathan had nights where he begged God for clarity, for a sign, for strength. He was torn between the weight of legacy and the whisper of truth. Was this the life his father envisioned for him? Was holding on to power worth losing peace? The answer eventually became clear. Staying would have meant compromising everything they stood for, and they weren't willing to do that. Not to themselves, not to their children, and certainly not to their faith. The moment they decided to walk away wasn't some dramatic outburst. It was quiet, painful, thoughtful. They sat together, looked at the life they were building, and asked the hardest question of all. Is this really what God wants for us? When the answer came, it didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with tears, fear, and deep peace. They knew they had to let it go. All of it. People were shocked. Why would they walk away from everything? From guaranteed income? From global influence? From their future? But what most people missed is that the Lambs weren't walking away from a job. They were walking away from a system that no longer aligned with their spirit. They were walking away from the noise, the politics, the expectations that weighed too heavily on their souls. And the cost was real. They didn't have a secret fortune. There was no $1 million exit package. They still had a mortgage. They still had bills. They were scared. But they were free. Susie once said that peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's knowing you're doing what's right even when it costs everything. And that's exactly what they were living. What's powerful about their story is that they didn't leave bitter. They didn't burn bridges. They didn't point fingers. They simply said no more to what wasn't true anymore. They chose quiet over control, faith over fear, conviction over comfort. Since then, they've lived a different kind of life. No big platforms, no corporate titles, just raw, honest, day-by-day obedience. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And in a world that constantly rewards performance, that kind of authenticity stands out. Their story reminds us that walking away isn't always failure. Sometimes it's the bravest thing a person can do. Jonathan and Susie could have kept pretending, but they didn't. And now they're living proof that peace doesn't come from holding on. It comes from letting go. So why did they walk away? Because they had to. Because their souls were more valuable than any paycheck, because truth mattered more than tradition, and because at the end of the day, no title, no legacy, and no ministry empire is worth losing yourself for. Sometimes the greatest testimony isn't in what you build, it's in what you're willing to lay down. And that's what makes their story unforgettable. They could have had it all: the platform, the legacy, the respect, The influence. Jonathan and Susie Lamb were positioned perfectly to inherit the throne of a global Christian empire. Daystar. Everything that had been built by Marcus Lamb over decades was within reach. The keys were on the table. The doors were opened. The title of president was written, signed, promised. But instead of stepping into that power, they walked away. Most people wouldn't have. Most people don't. In a world where ambition often wears the mask of calling and influence is confused for impact, it's rare to see someone willingly lay down power, especially when it's been handed to them without a fight. But that's what makes Jonathan and Susie's decision so unusual, so honest, so disruptive, and maybe, just maybe, so holy. Let's be honest, power feels good. Recognition feels even better. To be seen, respected, given the mic and the room, it feeds something deep inside all of us. And when that power is wrapped in the language of ministry, it's even harder to walk away from, because it's not just a job, it's purpose, it's God's calling, it's legacy. And those are hard things to let go of. But the truth is, calling and position aren't always the same. And that's what Jonathan and Susie had to face, slowly and painfully. At first, everything looked right. Jonathan had been involved in Daystar for years. He was the son of Marcus Lamb, the founder, and had earned his place through service, not just his last name. Susie was right by his side, supporting, working, raising their family while staying grounded in faith. They weren't just inheriting a ministry. They were part of it, shaped by it, rooted in it. And then came the moment when Jonathan was officially promised the role of president. In writing, it wasn't speculation, it wasn't assumed. It was planned, discussed, confirmed. Everyone around them knew what was coming. And after Marcus Lamb passed, Jonathan stepped into the role of vice president, and Susie received a significant pay bump as well. For the first time in years, things looked stable. Financially, they were secure. No more scraping by. No more wondering if the next season would bring strain. They had a nice house, a steady paycheck, and the future looked bright. In fact, that would have been the perfect time to settle in and stay, to enjoy the fruits of their faithfulness, to receive what had been promised. But something didn't feel right, because even though the salary was there, the peace wasn't. Even though the platform was within reach, their spirits weren't settled. Even though they had power, they didn't have alignment. And no paycheck can cover that kind of spiritual unrest. Behind the scenes, the story was more complicated than anyone outside the ministry could see. Jonathan and Susie were starting to wrestle with decisions being made, values being compromised, and truths being silenced. They felt the pressure to stay quiet, to play the game, to keep the peace by avoiding conflict. But what if that silence was costing them their soul? What if their peace required walking away? That kind of choice doesn't happen in one day. It's a long, gut-wrenching process. Late-night conversations, tears, prayers that feel unanswered, questions that don't go away. They weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were just uneasy. And unease is the first crack in the dam of comfort. The turning point came not when the ministry failed them, but when they realized staying would have meant failing themselves. Staying would have meant pretending, ignoring, endorsing things they couldn't in good conscience support. And when faith becomes performance, it stops being faith. It becomes survival. So they made a choice that shocked many. They said no. They said no to position, no to fame, no to money. They gave up the title. They walked away from the legacy. They laid it all down, not because it was burning, but because they knew they couldn't carry it anymore without losing who they were. And they did it quietly. No press conferences, no dramatic exits, no social media storms. Just a quiet, painful, obedient departure. Not out of rebellion, but out of conviction, because they believed that obedience to God was worth more than applause from people. And in that decision, they didn't just lose influence, they gained something most people in leadership never find: peace. Not the kind that comes from a paycheck or a public platform, the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if nobody else understands it. The kind that comes from laying down the weight you were never meant to carry in the first place. And maybe that's the kind of leadership the church needs more of. Not the kind that clings to power, but the kind that's willing to walk away from it. Not the kind that needs a microphone to feel worthy, but the kind that knows when to go silent. Not the kind that climbs the ladder, but the kind that tears it down for the sake of integrity. Jonathan and Susie aren't perfect, they never claim to be. But in a world of celebrity pastors and polished statements, their story stands out. It's raw, it's real, it's full of struggle. But it's also full of a strange, quiet kind of courage that's hard to find. They're not trying to build their own empire now. They're not trying to start another brand. They're living simply, by faith. They still have bills, still have a mortgage, they're not sitting on millions. And they're okay with that, because peace is worth more than position. Their story is a call to all of us, especially those in leadership, to examine what we're holding on to and why. To ask whether the thing we're chasing is truly from God or just the illusion of success. And if we find ourselves out of alignment, to remember, it's never too late to lay it down. This generation doesn't need louder leaders, it needs braver ones. Leaders who choose character over charisma, conviction over convenience, peace over position. And Jonathan and Susie Lamb have become unlikely examples of that. Not because they fought for the throne, but because they walked away from it. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them true leaders after all.